Picture this. You're a 12-year-old boy living in a Bulgarian village in 1550. The morning fog clings to the valley like a shroud while you help your father watch the sheep. The bells around their necks make a soft melody that has been the sound of your whole life. Your mother is preparing breakfast, bread still warm and goat's milk that feels like home, like safety, like everything you know. And then you hear it, the thunder of hooves striking the stones. Your father's face becomes white as parchment. Your mother drops the clay pitcher she is holding, and it shatters on the ground, just as your world is about to break. Because everyone in the village knows what those hoofbeats mean. The Sultan's collectors are here. You watch from behind a wooden cart as Ottoman officials step off their horses. Their silk robes clean even after the long journey. They carry scrolls and papers, and their eyes move across the villagers with the cold care of merchants valuing cattle. One of them points straight at you. Your mother falls to her knees, begging in a language they do not hear. Your father stays silent, knowing that any resistance means death for all of you. You are pulled away with words that you will serve the Sultan, that you will rise, that this is an honor. But as the cart moves away from everything you knew, the only sound left is your mother's sobs fading behind. You will never see her again. This was the beginning of your new life as a palace boy, a ghulam, in the strongest empire of the world. And the cruelty behind the palace walls would make you wish for those simple mornings among the sheep and the mist of your home. Before going further into these forgotten stories of pain and survival, if you like learning the hidden truths of history, press like, subscribe, and write in the comments where you are watching from. It is amazing that we explore these old stories together from different places, joined across time. The march to Istanbul was your first taste of that cruelty. For weeks you and dozens of other boys were forced across hard land, poorly fed, sleeping outside or in crude shelters that gave almost no protection. The weak, the ill, those who lost hope, they were left behind to die. You learned the first rule before even reaching the capital: weakness meant death. Only the strong, clever, or obedient survived. The boy walking next to you, around 14, had been taken from a Greek fishing village. His name was Nikos, though he whispered that soon he would not be allowed to keep it. On the third night he tried to run, but the guards caught him before he went a mile. They dragged him back and beat him in front of all the others as a warning. His screams echoed through the night, and you closed your eyes to block the sound. But you could not. The lesson stayed. Escape was impossible, resistance was pointless. By the time you reached the edge of Istanbul, you had learned to move like a shadow, to speak only if spoken to stay invisible when the guards' attention grew dangerous. You had seen boys vanish during the night, some who tried to escape, others who simply could not endure one more day. Their missing places in the line were constant reminders of your own fragile life. The first sight of Istanbul's skyline should have been stunning. The tall minarets cutting into the sky, the huge dome of Hagia Sophia, the vast palace complex that would become your prison. But all you felt was empty fear sinking in your stomach like a stone. This splendid city meant everything you had already lost, and everything you feared you might turn into. Upon arrival in Istanbul, you met your first selection. Ottoman officials divided the boys who survived into groups according to their judged potential. The procedure was degrading and exact. They checked your teeth as if you were a horse, tested your reflexes, made you recite what little knowledge you had of letters and numbers. They measured your height, looked at your skin for marks, and studied your features with the cold distance of art examiners. The most intelligent and attractive were chosen for the palace school, the Enderun. Others became janissaries, the empire's elite military force. But for those chosen for palace service, another trial awaited. One that would test not only your body's strength, but your soul's ability to endure constant dehumanization. You were among those selected for the Enderun school inside Topkapi Palace. The men who picked you saw your clear skin, your bright eyes, and your sharp mind, and they smiled. You did not understand then that those smiles were not kind. They were the smiles of hunters who had found promising prey. The Enderun school is often described as the first institutional education for the gifted. That phrase, while technically true, hides the darker reality of what such schooling meant for boys like you. Yes, you would study languages: Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. You would learn mathematics, astronomy, law, and literature. You would also be trained in music, calligraphy, and various crafts. But this education carried a cost that went far beyond study. The palace that became your world was a maze of marble halls, decorated chambers, and hidden corridors, where danger might be waiting at every corner. You were placed in dormitories inside the palace grounds, shut away from the outside world by walls, guards, and strict rules that made escape not just hard, but impossible to imagine. The dormitory where you would sleep stretched before you like a marble grave, lined with small beds covered in silk that felt more like chains against your body. On your first night there, you lay awake listening to the sounds that would become the background of your captivity. The quiet sobbing of boys missing their homes, trying to hide their crying in their pillows. The whispered voices in tongues you did not recognize. The steps of older students and supervisors walking the halls after darkness fell. You held tightly to the small wooden cross your mother had placed in your hand when you were taken away, but by the next morning, even that last link to your old life was found and taken. You were given a new name, Mehmet, and ordered to forget your Christian roots. Conversion to the empire's official religion was not a choice. It was a central part of turning you from a stolen child into a servant of the Ottomans. The ritual was carried out with pomp, as though you had accepted it willingly, but you knew, and so did everyone, that there was no choice at all. You repeated the words they gave you, but inside, you clung to the memory of your mother's songs and your father's tales. The darkest part of your training was the steady breaking of your personal will and the rebuilding of you as a tool for imperial service and pleasure. The palace lived by a strict hierarchy, where advancement rested not only on studies, but on how well you pleased your elders, and pleasing could mean things no child should be forced to learn. Your first lesson in those hidden rules came from Ahmet, an older student already 3 years in the system. He came to you one evening in the dormitory, his tone both warning and promise. "You're new," he said, sitting on the edge of your bed without asking. "You don't yet understand how this place works, but I can shield you, guide you, help you rise. The teachers trust me," he explained, "and they hear my advice about the younger boys." His hand rested on your shoulder, and you froze. You were 12 and had never been touched by a stranger, but something in his manner made your skin crawl. In return, he whispered, you would need to show gratitude. There are ways younger boys can repay older students for their protection, special ways that remain secret. You faced the same impossible decision that countless boys before you had faced. Refuse and risk savage punishment, isolation, and the loss of any hope for promotion. Accept and give up the last part of your childhood innocence to a system that treated your body as a trade for protection and favor. There was no real choice, only the will to endure. The palace's sexual hierarchy was both complex and predatory, following rules created through generations of abuse. Eunuchs, castrated when they were boys and often carrying their own mental scars, held great power and used it to take advantage of the steady flow of new arrivals. They understood the system completely because they had once suffered under it, but instead of protecting the newcomers, many became its most loyal enforcers. Older students preyed upon younger ones, repeating cycles of abuse that had lasted for generations. It was a distorted type of initiation, where those already inside earned their position in the order by hurting those beneath them. Palace officials also used their authority to reach the most attractive boys freely, knowing their victims had no help and no one to hear their cries for justice. What made this structure especially harmful was how closely it was tied to the palace's official hierarchy. Sexual ties were not secret scandals. They were accepted as part of the order, woven into daily routine so deeply that they seemed normal and unavoidable. Boys who caught the attention of strong patrons could rise more quickly, study with less burden, and live more comfortably. Those who refused or angered their elders were pushed to lowly tasks, faced harsher discipline, or vanished completely from palace records. The emotional effect on boys like you was enormous and carefully created. Cut off from family, stripped of your first identity, and placed in a world where your body was treated as property, you developed what today we might call trauma responses. Some boys became clever and manipulative, using their sexuality as a way to survive and to advance. Others turned inward, becoming empty shells who acted out palace life while their spirits slowly died. You saw both changes among the boys around you. Dmitri, taken from the same region as you, learned to smile and charm the older students and teachers. Within half a year he had better clothes, better meals, and even a private tutor for languages. But his eyes looked lifeless, and he no longer spoke of his family or his home. When new boys arrived, he watched them with the same cold look that the officials had once given him. Stefanos, a Greek boy and son of a fisherman, chose the opposite path. He refused every approach, suffered beatings and punishments, and slowly faded into something ghost-like. He did his duties mechanically, studied enough but without interest, and seemed to disappear more with each passing day. One morning his bed was empty, and his name was never spoken again. You tried to find a middle way, accepting some things to survive while holding on to a part of yourself untouched. But the palace was built to crush such balance, making compromise impossible. Every day brought more tests, new choices between humiliation and destruction, new ways the system tried to reshape you in its own image. European visitors who entered the Ottoman court sometimes caught glimpses of this hidden reality, though their descriptions were often shaped by their own cultural prejudices and limited knowledge. A Venetian ambassador in the 16th century mentioned the extreme affection palace officials showed toward their young male attendants, describing scenes that left him deeply uneasy. He wrote of boys as young as 10 or 11 clothed in silk and jewels, serving older men with a closeness that suggested ties far beyond the normal master-servant role. A French diplomat in the 17th century wrote more openly about what he saw during a palace gathering. The young pages moved through the halls like colorful birds in cages, their eyes lowered while their bodies were decorated for display. It was impossible not to notice the possessive way certain officials looked at these children, and the fear shining in the boys' eyes when their masters came near. The physical conditions of palace life made the psychological harm even worse, deliberately designed to destroy resistance and build dependency. You lived in packed dormitories with almost no privacy, where every action was under surveillance and control. You were woken before dawn for prayers you had been forced to memorize, given meals that were sufficient but never abundant, always at exact times, and placed under a rigid schedule that allowed no space for reflection or protest. Punishments were constant and carefully designed to degrade and break spirits. Boys who broke rules, spoke their native languages, practiced forbidden traditions, or failed to show enough zeal for their new lives, faced beatings, public shaming, or confinement in rooms barely large enough to lie down. You saw a boy named Milos, caught praying in the way of his old faith, forced to stand naked in the courtyard for an entire day, while other students were told to ridicule him. The message was clear. Your former identity was not only forbidden, but treated as shameful. The palace's inner economy added further complications and new levels of exploitation. You could obtain small rewards through obedience, study success, or by pleasing those above you in different ways. These rewards, better meals, finer clothes, softer beds, or access to books and instruments, became valuable treasures in your restricted life. The system built a web of obligations and loyalties that made resistance nearly impossible, while collaboration appeared the only path to survival. You learned to move through this economy with the sharp mind of someone much older. You found that helping older students with their studies could earn protection from their demands. You discovered that showing skill in specific lessons could gain you the favor of teachers who might defend you from the worst abuse. You saw that total obedience and visible passion for your new role could bring small liberties that felt enormous in your confined world. Some boys still tried to escape, but the palace stood on a peninsula surrounded by water, making this nearly impossible. Those caught were punished harshly, always in public, to frighten the rest. You saw a boy dragged back after trying to swim across the Golden Horn. Barely alive, he was beaten before all of you so badly he was left crippled. He remained as a permanent warning, broken, half-functioning, living proof of what happened when rebellion replaced submission. The few who managed to get away faced even greater challenges. They had been trapped in the palace so long, their first identities erased so completely, that returning to former lives was hopeless. Their families might not know them, their villages might cast them out as traitors or converts, and they had little skill that could help them survive outside the palace walls. Most boys who escaped were caught again within days, and even those who managed to stay free often found themselves lost in a world with no place for them. As you grew inside the palace, surviving through cleverness, adaptability, and carefully measured obedience, you faced new trials and deeper corruption of your spirit. The most successful students could one day be appointed to important government offices, but this success came with the price of keeping alive the very system that had destroyed them. You slowly understood with horror that your teachers and supervisors, the same men who had shaped and harmed you, had once been boys like yourself, taken from their families and changed into tools of imperial rule. This knowledge gave you a terrible choice. Resist the system and almost certainly be crushed by it, or accept it fully and become one of its enforcers, choosing new boys, breaking them and rebuilding them, maintaining the palace order of dominance and exploitation. Many chose the second path, finding it easier to become predators than to stay victims forever. The graduation ritual, called chikma, marked the end of palace schooling and your beginning in imperial duty. After years of systematic abuse disguised as training, you left the palace as a man skilled in several languages, trained in diplomacy and government, educated in the sciences and arts, but also as someone whose soul had been deeply corrupted, whose idea of power was linked with abuse, whose ability to build normal human ties had been permanently damaged. For many boys, this transition meant only moving from one form of exploitation to another. Those sent into administration entered a world where sexual favors and politics were still connected, where the palace lessons about authority, obedience, and survival followed them into adulthood. Those sent into the army carried the mental scars of their youth, often becoming either ruthless enforcers of the empire's will or broken men, unable to find meaning in lives built on trauma. The Ottoman ruling class's view of these practices was carefully shaped to protect the system while denying its worst parts. Though official rules forbade many acts of abuse, in reality palace leaders ignored behavior that served their interests. The purpose of the system was to produce skilled officials and faithful servants, and that goal outweighed everything else. The human cost was treated as irrelevant, and critics were dismissed as ignorant of the empire's refined methods of discipline and promotion. Some Ottoman writers of the time admitted the darker parts of the system, while insisting on its overall value. One historian of the 16th century wrote, "It is true that the palace school demands many sacrifices from its pupils, and not all who enter leave unchanged. But out of this furnace of discipline and study come the finest servants of the empire, men tested in loyalty and sharpened in skill." Such words of transformation and excellence hid the truth of what boys like you endured. Your tests meant repeated sexual violation. Your discipline meant the loss of your first identity, and the building of a new self meant to serve the empire. Your education cost you your childhood innocence and the ability to form normal bonds. What makes the Ottoman palace especially disturbing is how it joined real opportunities for learning with constant abuse in ways that made it impossible to separate gains from horrors. Yes, boys did receive education that was by the standards of the age highly advanced. You learned reading and writing in languages that opened doors across the world. You studied science and mathematics that were advanced for the time. You trained in diplomacy, ruling, and military skills that could shape your future. But this education could not be separated from exploitation. The same masters who trained your mind also violated your body. The same palace that gave you skills also destroyed your innocence. The same palace institution that promised advancement also guaranteed that success would always be stained by the methods used to reach it. The system showed the complicated link between authority, sexuality, and violence in pre-modern societies. The Ottomans were not alone in their use of young people. Similar customs existed in different forms across the ancient and medieval worlds. But the Ottoman structure was remarkable for its size, its organization, and its integration into imperial life. It was not some hidden corruption but an open institution, praised for its efficiency and defended by those who benefited from it. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the palace order began to weaken. New military technologies reduced the need for janissaries, new styles of administration lessened dependence on palace-trained officials, and European influence along with shifting attitudes helped change the system. Yet for the thousands of boys who entered the palace gates during its height, these reforms came too late. their childhoods lost, their innocence destroyed, and their spirits broken in the name of imperial authority stand as one of history's most organized examples of institutional child abuse. The boys who endured learned to live in a world where beauty was both blessing and curse, where their intellect was useful but their humanity ignored, where rising in rank meant giving away parts of their souls that could never return. Some rose to high positions of power, viziers, generals, governors shaping the empire's fate. But they carried the wounds of their palace years, and many repeated the same cycles of abuse that had shaped them. Others slipped into obscurity, their stories lost, remembered only in palace records listing their arrival, their training, and their assignment to service. The palace walls that once rang with their footsteps still stand today, now a museum where tourists admire the splendor and treasures of the Ottoman court. Visitors gaze at the fine rooms where the empire's elite were trained, but they see only the outward beauty. The marble corridors hide their darkest secrets, and the chambers where education and abuse overlapped stay silent about the price paid by generations of boys for imperial greatness. Guided tours speak of the school's innovations, its role in creating skilled officials, its contribution to the empire's glory. They never mention the systemic abuse that was at its core, the boys who died rather than submit, or the men who walked out forever marked by what they had endured. As I close this account, imagining your life as one of thousands, I am reminded that these tales of pain and endurance are not curiosities from history. They were real children, taken from their homes, stripped of identity, forced to survive in a world that valued their minds and bodies while ignoring their humanity. You, the boy I pictured standing in marble corridors, fear in your chest and silence on your lips, represent countless real children whose names are gone, whose personal stories were never written, whose suffering was never admitted by the system that used them. Your shadow, and the shadows of all like you, still linger in those palace halls, reminding us that behind every empire's magnificence lies a foundation built on suffering, and that the cost of power is often paid by those who have no choice. The horror was not only in the violence, but in how methodically it was used, how fully it was normalized, and how quickly it was forgotten. You and boys like you lived and died in a system that treated you as objects to be shaped and consumed, and your stories deserve remembrance, not as distant footnotes, but as witness to human strength against systematic cruelty. The morning air that once carried your frightened steps has long vanished, but your story still echoes through time, asking us to remember your pain and the terrible price of the empire's golden age. In remembering you, we honor not only your suffering, but the suffering of all children caught in the machinery of power through history, used and discarded by systems that valued conquest above mercy, empire above innocence.